welcome everybody to the 2023 Antipode lecture. And it's a great privilege to be able to introduce Adam Elliott Cooper. Adam's a lecturer in public and social policy at Queen Mary. And he's the author of a kind of wonderful book and really kind of important political intervention, Black Resistance to British Policing, that was published a couple of years ago with Manchester University Press. And it speaks to his really important set of both intellectual and political engagements with locating struggles against policing in a broader political analysis, which links to the kind of decisive impact of histories and geographies of colonialism and shaping forms of kind of racist policing in Britain. And I think he does this in the book in really important ways, both thinking about colonial histories, but also the importance of kind of anti-colonial histories and geographies as well. As well as being a kind of writer of books like this and contributing to another important book, Empire's Endgame, he's also very involved in struggles against racist policing as a member of the kind of monitoring group, and has also written important, incisive, short political interventions. He wrote a fantastic piece attacking, I think, presciently, before it was a kind of broader set of engagements, attacking Keir Starmer's response to the Black Lives Matter movement, which really kind of drew attention to the kind of racialized forms of authoritarianism that are constitutive of Starmer's kind of project. So before passing over to Adam, just wanted to kind of say a big thanks to everybody who's been involved in Antipode over the past year, and Andy for keeping us on the road, but also to people who've been doing things like refereeing. Refereeing is not a glamorous thing to do, and particularly when you're kind of fitting that in along the kind of usual academic work of being on strike. This is something that we really value. So thanks for doing that, and we've got a reception after, but I'll pass you over to Adam now.
Okay. Afternoon, everyone. So massive thank you to everyone at Antipode, not just for keeping such an important radical journal going in geography in these very difficult and turbulent times, but also, of course, for the invitation today to speak to you all about some of the work that I've been thinking through and working on over the last few years. So I want to talk a little bit today about, in many ways, our current conjuncture, the contemporary racial landscape of Britain, and what that can maybe tell us about the wider political environment that we currently find ourselves in. And I'm going to be thinking about it in the British context, but I'm going to be drawing on other examples from other parts of the world and other histories as well to think about these kinds of questions relating to race and state power in a wider, more international context. And I guess I began to think about these kinds of questions quite a long time ago, before I even realised the kinds of questions that I was asking. And I was thinking back as to when I first started to grapple with them, and it brought me back to the year 2012. In 2012, in East London, near where I was living, the Olympic Games were taking place, being hosted, of course, in East London, with over £10 billion being brought to the most deprived area of Britain's capital. It was a year after the 2011 riots following the police killing of Mark Duggan, and as I'm sure many people here are aware, there was a massive escalation in policing and securitisation. We were seeing anti-aircraft missiles and other forms of military machinery being put on the roofs of many residential buildings. And of course, there was a huge escalation in policing. And this was before I'd even begun my doctoral research, and I was volunteering at an organisation called the Newham Monitoring Project, a community organisation set up in the 1980s in East London to monitor and challenge policing and racial violence. And at this time, there was a real problem a particular kind of problem with police harassment. Of course, you had this sharing of contested space between the residents, predominantly working class, overwhelmingly people of colour, living in Newham, Tower Hamlets area of East London, and of course the spectacle of the Olympics, the necessity to provide a sanitised corporate image of London. And the Olympics, of course, also took place during the holy month of Ramadan. And many young people, in particular from the Horn of Africa, from West Africa, from parts of South Asia, were out at nights, attending mosque, socialising, and this would lead them very often into confrontations with the police, one of which actually led to a young man having his leg broken. And so the New Monitoring Project began organising sessions and initiatives to monitor police activity, to challenge stops, searches, cases of arrest, questionings, and what have you. And I remember one particular confrontation in which myself and a few other volunteers confronted a police officer who was searching some young people in the local area. And someone in the group said, you know, we're going to monitor this stop and search, and the reason for this is because we know that the Metropolitan Police are institutionally racist. And the response of the police officer was interesting. The police officer said, "Are you calling me institutionally racist?" And our response was, "Oh, you can't be institutionally racist. You're not an institution. You're a human being." And the police officer kind of looked back at us, slightly confused, frustrated, not quite angry yet, trying to work out whether this was a veiled insult or a kind of weird appeal to a kind of a common humanity, maybe. But I think in this particular instance, it was neither. Here, I think two groups of people were talking past each other. And as I began to think about it more, actually, two different kind of sets of ideologies were thinking past each other. And the way in which this manifested itself was because they both had very different understandings of what institutional racism constitutes. And as I began to think about this interaction, I began to see this kind of interpersonal chaos play out on the national stage. And one of the ways in which I saw this happen was through the many reports, reviews, inquiries, committees set up by various government bodies to determine the extent or existence of, or lack thereof, of institutional racism. So, for instance, in that same year, 2012, there was a quite terrible report that I hope no one ever reads called "It Took Another Riot," commissioned by the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. It was like a long time ago, right? And here, institutional racism is only mentioned once, and institutional racism is actually something that instills fear in the police. Fear to act to prevent crime from taking place. And so we see here this dismissal of institutional racism as something actually which is being used against the police rather than something which is a necessary and an accurate criticism. Similarly, jumping forward to 2016, we have the first of two Baroness Casey reports. But in this Baroness Casey report of 2016, she suggests, among one of her many quite terrible policy proposals, an integration oath for migrants, to encourage immigrants to embrace British values, with more focus on promoting the English language, encouraging social mixing among young people, and securing, quote, women's emancipation in communities where they are being held back by regressive cultural practices. Here, perhaps Baroness Casey was reading the general culture, political culture of Britain in 2016, of course, the year of the Brexit referendum. A year later, the government commissioned David Lammy to carry out a review of the criminal justice system, and although he doesn't dare mention that term, institutional racism, he does go as far as at least talking about discrimination and disproportionality. And of course, by 2021, following the massive protests the year before, the government goes on the offensive, and its Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities claims there is no institutional racism, to wide ridicule. I remember even listening to LBC and having them do a not too bad takedown of this quite terrible set of political arguments. And then, of course, the most recent, the Casey Report of 2023, very different to that of 2016. And I think, again, she's reading the political temperature of the nation, particularly following the protests of 2020 and of the Sarah Everard protests which followed. And here, institutional racism, homophobia, corruption, and crucially also sexism are considered to be endemic in the police. And so one of the things I began to get interested in was, how did these different people or institutions analysing the same phenomenon in the same place come to such different conclusions? And what can that tell us about the current racial landscape and wider political conjuncture that we currently find ourselves in? And to help us answer this question, I'm going to explore today the history of this term, institutional racism, and the ways in which it has been interpreted in very different ways by different people, political institutions, and ideologies. And of course, the story of this term is going to require us, as I've mentioned, to look beyond Britain's national borders, as the racial geographies of the post-colonial states mean that anti-racist thought and action can't, of course, be confined to a parochialism, but rather we must think, as Ms. Yunus posits, on the scale of the world when considering both the geographies of British racism, but crucially attempting to radically reimagine human social relations. But crucially as well, re-examining the story of institutional racism doesn't come with the intention of everyone going home today knowing exactly what this term really means so they can make sure they use it properly. Right, I'll leave that to the race equality consultants. Rather, it is in the hope that we can better understand its histories and functions, better enabling us to move towards a world in which this routinely reheated term is once and for all obsolete. And so to do this, I'm going to tell three kind of interrelated and overlapping stories of institutional racism. I'm going to talk a little bit about its original iterations in the 1960s and 70s. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the state-led liberal institutions, the commissions, the inquiries, the reviews. I'll try not to make it too boring. And then at the end, I'm going to think about the newer iterations of this term, both those adopted by the right as well as by the emergent left. Okay. Oh, I should have said that. Okay. So, the original iteration of this term, institutional racism. When white terrorists bomb a black church and kill 5 black children, that's an act of individual racism, widely deplored by most segments of society. But when the same city, Birmingham, Alabama, 500 black babies die each year because of lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities, that is a function of institutional racism. This is the definition of institutional racism when the term is coined by Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, and Charles Hamilton in their book Black Power and the Politics of Liberation in 1967. But of course, many people across the United States and elsewhere already knew this, right? They knew that, and I think to put it succinctly, the normal functioning of racism produces racist outcomes, right? This is maybe how we can succinctly define institutional racism, right? When the normal functioning of an institution produces racist outcomes. But I think what's more crucial in this book, laid out in this book, is answering the question, why? And writing in the US context, Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton use the analogy of the colony to explain how and why these racist outcomes arise. And of course, while black people in 1960s America do not constitute a colony in the literal sense, they argue, racial hierarchies of colonialism and the power used to enforce those hierarchies are applicable to US institutions. Right? So what do they mean by that? So partly they're thinking about what is later referred to as racial capitalism. right? The idea that capitalism needs to categorize different kinds of workers differently in order to devalue their work in different kinds of ways, right? Feminists have talked about this, of course, in the ways in which certain forms of gendered labour are devalued, or not considered work at all, of course. But of course, we see this with race as well, and different forms of labour, racialised in specific ways, are devalued, right, and therefore require less remuneration, fewer securities, and other forms of social benefits and what have you. And these patterns, the authors argue, reflect the racialised exploitation and violence in colonies like Rhodesia and South Africa. But the further question is why? Right? Why were they set up in this particular kind of way? Right? And they argue that these institutions were set up to reproduce racial hierarchy, to facilitate capitalist exploitation and control. Right? So the institutions that were set up in Rhodesia, set up in South Africa, the legal institutions, the political institutions, the economic institutions, were premised on racial hierarchy. And racial hierarchy was necessary in places like Rhodesia and South Africa for the kinds of models of capitalism required in order to reproduce and maximize capitalist profits. And when they look at these actual colonies in Rhodesia and South Africa, they can say that in the United States context, we can see a very similar thing happening. We can see indigenous people being considered generally surplus to the needs of capital. We can see black labour being a particular type of exploited labour. We can see migrant labour from parts of East Asia being a different type of exploited labour. We can see white workers or workers who become white as they migrate from different parts of Europe being exploited in differential kinds of ways. Therefore, for Toure and Hamilton, institutional racism has another name: colonialism. But what about Britain? Right, you can make this argument, of course, that Rhodesia and South Africa are similar to the United States in that they are all colonies or post-colonies at the very least. But Britain is a very kind of different context. And for that, I want to turn to another great thinker, a man called John La Rose, who's a Guyanese publisher and activist who did most of his work here in Britain in the 1960s and 70s. And in the 1960s, John La Rose wrote this great article called "We Did Not Come Alive in Britain." And what he says in this article is that there is this dominant narrative, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with, in which people from Britain's colonies in the Caribbean and other parts of the empire as well. No. I'm not sure what's happened there. Oh, it's back. And many other colonies come to Britain and expect to be welcomed with open arms, right? They're invited to the mother country. And they are shocked and appalled and surprised that they experience bigotry and discrimination and harassment on the streets of Britain, right? Through employment or when trying to access housing and what have you. And John La Rose says, this might be a story for some people, but for many people, this is not the story of their experience. And in fact, many people had already experienced British racism in the colonial context. They experienced British racism in the colonial context, not because they'd necessarily come into contact with lots of white British people and experienced what's fashionable to say microaggressions these days or whatever it might be, but rather because they had come into contact with British capital in the plantations, in the mines, in the factories, at the docks. Because they had come into contact with the British colonial administration and its state bureaucracies, through the tax systems, through the courts, through its police forces, through the military interventions that were brought in to quell strikes and what have you. And so it's this structural understanding of racism which begins people's understanding of British racism for many people migrating in the post-war period. And it's only subsequently that they begin to experience and better understand the more interpersonal forms of racism that they experience from their co-workers and from their neighbours and from other people that they come across in British society. And so if we take this understanding from people like John La Rose, what we realise is that actually British institutions, which, if Britain was founded in 1707, right, as a nation state, many of these British institutions which have been established since the establishment of Britain cannot be understood as being national institutions. They are far better understood as being imperial institutions. The governance, the court systems, the centres of economic policy making were just as concerned with how to govern across its colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, Australia, and what have you, as they were the British mainland. In fact, as Sita Balani shows in her brilliant new book, Deadly and Slick, Britain's management of the colonies went as far as decreeing who should be able to have sex with whom and under what circumstances. Right? This is the level of detail that British governance went to in governing its colonies from Westminster, from the administrative centre of empire here in London. And so I think, therefore, we can understand British institutions not as, of course, the same as US institutions or the same as Rhodesian institutions, but similarly as being fundamentally imperial institutions, and therefore racial hierarchy being a fundamental necessity to the ways in which those institutions need to govern. But, of course, John LaRose was part of a wider movement of activists and thinkers who were very much aware of this. And one of these movements was an organisation called the Black Unity and Freedom Party, a Black Power organisation active in the 1960s and 70s who published a very interesting newspaper called The Black Voice. And in The Black Voice, there are two articles here that I want to pick up on. One of them you could see in your bottom left, which is about one of the first immigration bills which is introduced. And they describe this as a slave's charter, right? The idea that Britain is developing these border policies in order to prevent colonial or post-colonial migration is considered to be a way of controlling black labour in a way that, for them, is comparable, perhaps in quite an evocative way, to chattel slavery. But the other thing that they're interested in this particular moment is the attempt by Britain to begin recruiting more black police officers, particularly to the police forces in its urban areas. And the Black Unity and Freedom Party are very adamant that this is a bad idea, as you might be able to tell via the image. And what they argue in this quite a long editorial, trying to convince Britain's black communities not to sign up to this recruitment drive, is quite an interesting piece of analysis. They say, let us give an example. In order to rule India, the British used Indian troops under British officers. The same thing was done in Africa and in the West Indies. In this, British colonialists were able to fool people into believing that native troops were better than English troops. It also had the desired effect of quelling the rebellious spirit of the people. And so I think the Black Unity and Freedom Party are doing two quite interesting things here. The first thing, of course, they're telling us is that equality, diversity and inclusion isn't anything new. It's a well-rehearsed colonial practice, now cynically perhaps reheated here in the centre of empire to deal with the colonial migrants causing trouble and panic in the mother country. But of course, the other thing that they're telling us is that this goes beyond an illusion of progress. Right? This is, as they articulate quite explicitly, a tool of racism. And so for Britain's Black Power movements, the analogy of the colony is just as pertinent for black people living in Britain as the analogy of the colony is for black people living in the United States of America. And of course, it wasn't just activists who were making these colonial connections. It was also, of course, black intellectuals. And one of them, of course, was Stuart Hall. And in his landmark text, Policing the Crisis, there is quite an illuminating section which is subtitled The Black Colony. And here in the Black Colony, Hall and his colleagues were referring to places like Handsworth in Birmingham or other black urban areas of Britain, which are similarly not literal colonies, yet there are connections between Barbados and Brixton, right, which can't simply be reduced to being governed in one way or another by racial discrimination. Rather, they are spaces which, and here's the quote, economic and political and ideological factors converge. What has principally governed the flow of black labour is the underlying rhythms and requirements of British capital. And what has regulated the flow is, of course, legislative, i.e. political action. And what has prepared the ground for the use of black labour is a fluid and endlessly variable factor in the British industry is the growth of racism, right, ideologically. In other words, the function of the state is to facilitate racial hierarchy and exploitation for the needs of capital. And this made Britain's Black Power movements very critical of commissions. Right? They thought it would be absurd in many ways to instill trust in the state in dealing with any problems relating to racial inequality or racial hierarchy in Britain, because as we've seen, they understand these as being imperial institutions, right? Rooted and fundamentally in many ways connected to racial colonial governments. And so you should be unsurprised that when one of the first all-party select committees on race relations was established back in 1972, the Black Unity and Freedom Party didn't take it very seriously at all. And this was the headline that they decided upon in order to analyse this select committee. And the Black Unity and Freedom Party referred to it in their editorial under this headline as a bourgeois committee. Used to support a police force which commits atrocities against the working class sections of society, especially against black working class people, I quote. It argued that police racism, which was rooted in British colonialism, would continue unabated if these liberal reforms for diversity drives or police complaints tribunals, cultural training and control of particular publications, i.e. their publications, were implemented. And so here, what we really see is a coherent critique of states' racism, a really clear understanding of race as being historically constituted, and a quite holistic understanding of race as being fundamentally linked to class struggle. Right? These are the very clear sets of political priorities and commitments which were being articulated both by intellectuals such as Stuart Hall, in grassroots forms of publications such as Race Today and The Black Voice, but crucially also the people marching on the streets, such as the Black Unity and Freedom Party. Let's skip forward a little bit. From the 1960s and 70s up to the 1990s, a very different chapter in Britain's racial history. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in 1993, a young man called Stephen Lawrence is murdered by a group of racists, and the inquiry into the police mishandling of the investigation into his murder leads to a public inquiry led by a man called Sir William Macpherson. And what is quite remarkable about this particular public inquiry is that it is hugely influenced by activist groups who among a number of things, ensure that the term institutional racism is at the centre of the inquiry's sphere of investigation. However, I want to point out three interrelated problems with the Commission's liberal interpretation of institutional racism. One will be the historical and geographical context, or lack thereof. The second is its lack of the understanding of property, labour and racial capitalism. And the final problem with it will be its limited critique of the state. So in stark contrast to the black power politics of activists on both sides of the Atlantic in the 1960s and 70s, the Macpherson reports, like many other reports, inquiries, commissions, what have you, dehistoricises racism. Right? Racism is stripped of the histories of how it was used to rationalise colonial dispossession exploitation, and extraction. The Commission's historical gaps, therefore, are filled with an explanation of institutional racism that simply constitutes the sum total of individuals' prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racial stereotyping. And this reflects, I think, quite popular assumptions about racist ideas and practices as they emerge through a seemingly unexplained spontaneity among white people living in a multi-ethnic society. So what's implicit in many of these assumptions is that racism is this thing that kind of emerges, almost migrates, one might say, to Britain in the post-war period as people from Britain's darker colonies migrate in significant numbers during this period, right? Rather than understanding racism as in fact being an colonial and imperial export, which was being used, as I've mentioned, to facilitate capitalist exploitation and to rationalise different forms of both exploitation, violence and control. And this leaves Macpherson, as well as other reports that came afterwards, stuck between deciding whether racism is either the product of intentional bigots or unintentional racists, right? Rather than considering it to be a historically constituted system of exploitation, violence and control. Thus, many campaigns against racist police violence made demands based on these kinds of assumptions, right? Individual officers are to be disciplined or educated in order to remain professional when doing their job and stop failing in their role to protect people in the black communities from violence or harm. You can also see this, You can also see this with the more recent Casey reports, who does something slightly different with history. There isn't a complete historical amnesia, but there is something quite different happening here with history. Right? The Casey report does something in which here she says, policing by consent, pioneered in London and admired and copied around the world, requires the Metropolitan Police to both earn and maintain public trust in everything it does. Right? So this is both, of course, a historical distortion, right, as to how British policing spread across the globe, right? It wasn't simply admired and copied. And if it was admired and copied, it was admired and copied by the colonial administrators. As well as, of course, a colonial melancholia, I feel, right? And an inability to mourn the loss of the grandeur of Britishness and Britain, here symbolised by the moral decline of the British Bobby, who has descended into racism, right? Rather than this being something which is historically constituted. And this idea of consent, I think, is really crucial to understanding British policing. And I think it's encapsulated brilliantly through a fantastic set of forms of guidance on counterinsurgency policing, put together by the British government when a number of civil servants are brought in as consultants to help the Americans during the Vietnam War. And these British civil servants are brought into Vietnam because they were so successful, considered to be successful by the United States, following the counterinsurgency operations in Malaya in the decade previously. And what these civil servants say to the Americans is, look, when a Vietnamese farmer has one of his cows killed by the US forces, and he makes an official complaint to the US authorities about this cow being killed, and he wins his compensation claim, then I'll know we are winning the war. And what he means, of course, by this is that when our imperial institutions are considered to be the legitimate mechanisms of justice, when our occupying forces are the avenues through which legitimate and satisfactory and fair governance is manifested, then I will know we are winning the war. Because the war, of course, isn't simply about repressing the populations. That's not how you govern a subjugated people. Rather, it is when we are able to maintain and project hegemonic power, when we are able to, of course, as Casey says, police by consent. So rather than us understanding policing by consent as a far more humane and civilized and almost democratic way of policing, I think we should instead understand the idea of policing by consent as a far more sophisticated form of domination and control. The second problem with Macpherson reports and subsequent reports like Casey's, of course, is their lack of engagement with the political economy of racism. As I've already mentioned, racial capitalism, right? Of course, one of the key motivations for reproducing racism is that it enables capitalism to maximize profits and expand across the globe. Capitalism is one of the ways in which racism becomes material, right? Racial hierarchy shapes how workers are differently exploited, disciplined, or rendered surplus. More specifically, dispossession, enslavement, indenture, low-wage labour, and other forms of differentiated exploitation under capitalism are shaped by racial regimes which are constantly shifting to serve the interests of capital. Right? And as we explored earlier, utilising the work of Stuart Hall, this requires a convergence of economic, political, and ideological forces. Right? The requirement of capital, political policies, and cultures of racism. And the decontextualisation of racism from these social forces further entrenches the myth that the role of policing is to dispassionately enforce laws which do not favour any particular individual or group. The report concedes only that there exist in Britain, quote, public bodies as well as private individuals which are unwittingly discriminatory against black people, thus leading to institutional racism. So in other words, the Macpherson reports it doesn't frame individual prejudice as one of the outcomes of a racist system of exploitation and control historically constituted by colonialism. Rather, it frames individual prejudice and racial bias as psychological or moral deficiencies which then lead to otherwise objective and fair institutions producing racism. Specifically, the report's definition inverts the definition of Tourés and Hamiltons of institutional racism, making prejudice the prerequisite to institutional racism. In the world of the Independent Commission, therefore, the tail wags the dog. Finally, I think one of the clearest flaws, of course, in the Macpherson and other government reports and crucially state-led reports on institutional racism are, of course, their very thin critiques of the state. The Black Unity and Freedom Party, to return to them briefly, warned its readers in the 1970s that the state could not be trusted to tackle racism, as racism is integral to the state's power. Right? So we saw this, of course, with its criticism of the Immigration Acts, which they likened to a slaves' charter. Even despite the fact that the Macpherson report actually cites Touré and Hamilton's book Black Power, the report similarly frames institutional frames institutional racism as a form of state power. Macpherson and others deny the notion that laws and policies are racist. Rather, these state reports argue that it is the application of policies through which institutional racism arises. Right? So it's not the fact that the Immigration Acts are within them, in and of themselves, racist. It's the fact that the people implementing these forms of legislation are doing so in a discriminatory manner, right? According to these more liberal interpretations. So this clears politicians and policymakers of reproducing racism through legislation such as border controls, which target racialised minorities. And this kind of leaves the government facing both ways, right? Implementing policies which reproduce and deepen racism, while also leading initiatives which claim to combat racial inequality, validated further by recounting the racial discrimination that they themselves may have been subjected to. And I think Rishi Sunak, is probably an interesting example of this. Right? On the one hand, you have Rishi Sunak pushing through his illegal immigration bill. You have the emergence of these, what are effectively, of course, floating prisons for migrants. You have this dream of people on deportation flights to Rwanda, while at the very same time, Rishi Sunak speaking of the sting of racism, right, following a report into racial discrimination and bigotry within cricket. Right? And similarly with, and I think what this helps us to outline is that the policing and border regimes are not simply racist, they are only racist in the way in which they are run. Right? So the Casey report says there are systemic and fundamental problems, not with policing, but how the Metropolitan Police is run. Right? There are problems maybe at the top in terms of how things are run. The inspector of the constabulary, Matt Parr, has said that 1 in 10 police officers should never have made it through vetting after his team assessed a random sample of the officers. Right? So the problem are the officers right at the bottom. And so here we see liberalism removing the wider geographies of imperial racism, which are planetary in scale. Right? It relieves it from the burden of history and strips it from the politics of state power and the political economy of capitalism. Rather, through this, institutional racism is attributable to individuals, equipping a police officer who might be searching a young black man in East London during the 2012 Olympics to say, look, I've had the training, we're a diverse group of police officers, there's no way that I can be racist. And I think with a similar kind of logic, we can see Rishi Sunak and other members, photographed here on the front bench, as responding almost implicitly to the accusation of racism by saying, how can I be institutionally racist? Okay. Final bit. So in this final part, I want to think about between 2020 and our current moment, and how, despite the fact that there have been a number of kind of more liberal interventions from the states acknowledging in one way or another institutional racism, even if they interpret it in a way very different to how other activists have done so. There was, in many ways, a retreat from the liberal centre ground over the course of the last 2 or 3, 4, 5 years. And I want to talk a little bit about the current government and its rejection, wholesale, of any accusation of institutional racism, but also, crucially, the more radical contemporary critiques of the states which have emerged since the mass protest movements of 2020. So first, let's get this out of the way. So the government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, I love the way they avoid using the word racism, of course makes a number of quite bold assumptions about Britain. And of course the main conclusion of this particular report, which is supposed to be a response to the mass protests of 2020, is that Britain not only doesn't have a problem with institutional racism, but is in fact a model for the rest of the world in leading us against racial inequalities. And I think what's interesting and important isn't why they came to these kinds of conclusions. We can all probably guess why, right? There are clear ideological reasons. But how? How did they come to these particular assumptions? How do they rationalize it within the pages of this report? And the way this is done, I think, is crucial in thinking about the relationship between the right and the centre, the liberal centre. Because if the liberal centre ground strips the definition of institutional racism of its history, of its politics, of its political economy, what are we left with? We're left with this concept that kind of lives in people's heads, that maybe we can almost surgically or medically remove with the right kind of unconscious bias training. But if we're looking at evidence of institutional racism, right, and we see racist outcomes in policing or education or housing or whatever it might be, how do we know it's racism? Might just be a coincidence. And that's exactly what the report says. They say, okay, you've given us some evidence that shows unequal outcomes for different racialized groups of people in housing and education and policing. But this could just be different cultures, Some cultures might value education, some might not. This might be a geographical question. Certain racialized minorities might just happen to live in areas with poor housing. Or this might be simply in relation to household income, or what we might call class, right? Not race. But of course, the reason they're able to do this is because you can make these kinds of assumptions if racism has no history. If you can only understand racial outcomes institutions as being a very long history of a very unfortunate set of outcomes, then you can make these kinds of dismissive assumptions. Similarly, if you strip racism of its political economy and understand class as being something separate from race, rather than race and class being co-constitutive, you can say that this is class or this is household income rather than race, right? Rather than these things being connected. And similarly, rather than understanding race and space as being fundamentally linked to each other, rather than being co-constitutive to each other, you can say actually they're separate things, and maybe these outcomes that we're seeing here in this data can be explained by geography rather than race. And so the liberal centre provides is almost, we could maybe use the analogy of a gateway drug, right? It provides an avenue into interpreting evidence of institutional racism in any way you wish, because you stripped it of all of the history and the politics and the political economy, which helps us to analyse data, to interpret it as not simply being correlation, but causation. Okay. And of course, this report was in response to these mass protests of 2020, right? And we've already seen, of course, that how black power politics links resistance to police racism with wider struggles against capitalism and imperialism. But what I want to look at now in this final section is how abolitionism, the politics of abolitionism in the 21st century, here in Britain and elsewhere, draws on these radical politics of black power and anti-colonialism. And in doing so, I want to underline how these interconnected schools of thought provide the antidote to some of the failings of liberal anti-racism generally, and of those of these government-led commissions, inquiries, and reports specifically. So, I was talking to, as part of my research, a former member of the Black Unity and Freedom Party. And we were talking about, the protests that had taken place in 2020, and I was interested to see how she was reflecting on what had taken place over, all of these decades. And she said to me, Adam, what's all this abolitionism thing you guys are talking about? You young people want to abolish this, abolish that, abolish. When we were your age, we weren't talking about abolition, we were talking about global revolution. I said, okay. I'll have a word. And I guess that kind of made sense in the 1960s and 70s, right? The Cold War was raging. You had these third world movements rising in influence and power. You had this huge hope that an alternative both to capitalism and the global racial world order was possible. Right, was within arm's reach, right? We could almost see it, right? There were these very coherent anti-capitalist and anti-imperial social movements all over the world, which you could draw very clear links of solidarity and support with. And I mean, the pages of the Black Voice, that Black Unity and Freedom Party newspaper, are full of reports from strikes in Namibia and armed uprisings in Mozambique and big protest movements in Nicaragua and peasant uprisings in parts of South Asia and the armed struggle in Palestine or Ireland. All of these things are as important as what's taking place on the doorstep of the communities reading these newspapers in Britain during this time. So it makes sense, I think. But of course, that isn't the world in which we're currently living, for better or for worse. Rather, I think we're living in a context in which people are responding to a very different kind of set of geographical as well as political contemporary problems. Not seeing a world in which a rising third world supported by this problematic but in some ways potentially useful Soviet bloc can create a difference, an alternative kind of global order. But instead living in a world in which we're seeing a continual and exponential rise in the carceral state. Right? And when I think about the carceral state, I'm thinking as carcerality as constituting militarism as well as prisons and policing. And even if we think about Britain, right, here in Britain, the prison population has almost doubled since the 1990s. Right? The women's prison population has more than doubled during this period. Right? The expansion of police powers, their ability to stop, to search, to use different kinds of powers to arrest, their ability to monitor people, particularly their digital communications, has expanded continuously during this period. And so therefore, it is through this contestation with the carceral state, right, rather than an antagonism with a more direct form of imperialism, that people are articulating a revolutionary politics, as the Black Unity and Freedom Party might say, a global revolution. But they articulate it, of course, in very different ways, right? But they still do so, and they still do so by situating racism in a political and economic context, right? So they situate the struggle against racism as resistance to state power and capitalism through thinking through questions relating to the ending of austerity, right, and cuts to services and welfare, right, ending and abolishing the hostile environment, stopping school exclusions, right, rethinking white curriculums, right, accompanying the demands to defund the police, right. And what's happening here, I think, is that these calls to erode state power, right, simultaneously seek to address the very material antagonisms experienced by people all over Britain, particularly black people. But also they implicitly discredit liberal attempts to empower state institutions as the agents of anti-racist change, right? And I think it's worth noting here that I remember listening to an interview with Ruth Wilson-Gilmore in which she describes abolitionism, and the interviewee says, "That sounds a lot like communism to me." And she says, "That's because it is communism. But we're living in a different time now," she says to the interviewee, "and we can't go into communities and tell people about socialism or communism in the way in which perhaps we used to. We have a different set of antagonisms and therefore require a different set of discourses and articulations, right? And it is abolitionism which suits our current conjuncture." And so this approach rejects the kinds of state-approved training rolled out by governments in response to McPherson and other reports, and instead demands an anti-racism from below. Right? So this involves drawing on black power movements which connected policing to capitalism and imperialism, and prison abolitionism premised on the transformation of all other sites of contestation. Right? So in other words, radical black movements might have long sought to confront the very nature of the racist state and racial capitalism through grassroots and revolutionary visions. But abolitionism is also seeking to do that, and it's seeking to do that through a set of ideas and practices which want to simultaneously create forms of safety and community and justice which erode society's reliance on a continually expanding police and prison state. So community infrastructure like youth services or mental health provision or shelters for domestic violence survivors or trade unions and renters unions, they can do more than simply improve the material conditions of oppressed people or provide spaces for radical organising. Their empowerment improves community safety, right? They make people less likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system, right? Thus reducing the society's reliance on the state institutions of violence and control. And I think it's really telling that we've had a proliferation of very interesting texts over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly since the process of 2020, coming out of people involved in the organising in solidarity with Sarah Everard or in solidarity with the BLM process in the United States, making these kinds of arguments, thinking about the kinds of community infrastructure that they are building or want to build in response to police and prison power. Right? And so abolitionist politics don't limits resistance to policing to a direct confrontation with state agents, right? It's not simply these big protests and rebellions that might catch headlines, right? They're a vision that incorporates community-led forms of care and safety in order to reduce society's reliance on police and prison power. So the legal battles, the protests, the urban rebellions, these might be most often associated with black resistance to policing, right? But they are only one aspect of abolitionism. And the building of community infrastructure, which tends not to be linked to the erosion of police power, is rather fundamental to the erosion of police power, right? It's explicitly a politics of care, safety, and community development, as well as an antagonism, confrontation, and revolution, right? And it's one example of this wave of youth projects which are arguing that fewer policing and more forms of community infrastructure is the only solution to reducing violence and harm in working class communities. And one of the examples of that is a youth project, the picture you can see behind me, called the Forefront Project, which is based on an estate called the Graham Park Estate in North London. And so I think what we're seeing here in this retreat from the centre ground, with arguably a far right, if not a far right government, certainly a far right Home Office occupying one set of political terrain, but a set of social and political grassroots movements which are sick of the failures of a liberal set of state institutions which claim institutional racism, but provide us with nothing but superficial training and educational and diversity initiatives, means that the antagonisms and the contradictions in our current moment, I think, are more explicit and better illuminated than they've been since the 1960s and 70s, when the Black Power movements first began coining and using the term institutional racism. And I think if we are able to maintain and continue confronting the more proto-fascistic elements within our current border regimes and other aspects of Britain's both domestic and foreign policy, then I think we can build on the kinds of movements and ideas which have been popularised in 2020 and ensure that what was the largest anti-racist mobilisation in recent British history isn't something which is reduced simply to a moment, but is understood as a continuation of the politics of the 20th century, but also a fundamental way of ridding us of both the repulsion of the government's current racial politics, but also the dead end of the liberal state centrism that reinterprets and misinterprets the kinds of radical language which is attempting to change the world, not both in terms of race, but everything else as well. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Adam. That was fantastic. I love the idea of the liberal centre as a kind of gateway drug, and but also that really careful kind of positioning of the kind of different histories and geographies of institutional racism is really, really key to understanding, as you say, the kind of current conjuncture, but also I think the kind of mapping of new antagonisms you gave us at the end is, I think, really, really inspiring and important. So we have, in terms of engagement in the new conjuncture, we have both as questions in the hall. If you're going to give a question here, can you go to the lectern? And we also have a possibility for questions for those of you who are online as well. So can I invite questions? And Andy's going to manage the questions on the Slido. And if anybody has a question in the hall, could you please just go to the come to the lectern. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this incredible talk. I have a question about, in the UK context, if in this sort of era of commissions from the early 90s until now, is there, I mean, I study similar things in the US, and is there also this kind of like proliferation of different types of ways of institutionalizing this problem and then narrating it back to people, like nonprofits, obviously, and how you think about the ways that the abolitionist movement now sort of has to deal with this variegated terrain of political interests and funding streams, et cetera, that are often kind of vulnerable to co-optation in ways that maybe was not the case in the 60s. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. So I think there's two things. So the first thing, of course, is that defunding the police in Britain is very difficult because, unlike the United States, most funding for things like policing is very centrally managed rather than being decentralized. Right? This is part of the legacy of Thatcherism breaking up local councils and what have you, but also Britain's just general legacy of not being very democratic. But it's also, of course, a problem in relation to the ways that the idea around defunding the police can often empower other state institutions which are also carceral and oppressive, right? So we can think about social work in that kind of way, right? My mum's not watching this, but she's a social worker, sorry about that, but it is what it is. So we can see, right? So we can see how other kinds of institutions can often be empowered, right? But the other way in which we often see it taking place, and this is used a lot in the context of Glasgow, right? So in Glasgow, the United Nations come to Glasgow and say this is the most violent place in Western Europe, and Glasgow City Council, which is a relatively progressive council, says we're going to have this kind of public health approach to safety and harm reduction. And so we're going to be, using healthcare provision, mental health provision, youth services, kinds of training, provide housing, all of that kind of stuff. But all of those kinds of provisions for helping people at risk of being affected by violence are situated in the police station. And so, of course, what we're doing is they're taking some of the kind of logic and ideas of defunding the police, which is, actually, maybe the police isn't the best way to improve public safety, and we need other kinds of forms of social infrastructure in order to help keep people safe. But using that idea to further empower the police, right? And this is something, as I said, it's already happened in Glasgow. It's happening in Liverpool a little bit as well at the moment, and I can imagine it happening in other places as well. And I think the police are kind of unsure what to do about this because in some ways they don't want to do that work, right? They didn't get into policing so they can be nice to people, right? And so, but also this is more power, right? This is more resource, and this is certainly more control. So that's one aspect. But I think we can also think more broadly about this question of cooptation, right? And how the kinds of critical or maybe even radical language that has been being used by academics and scholars is being incorporated into our places of work, right? We can think about how, everyone, our institutions want to decolonize the lectern and the microphone and the pen or whatever it might be, right? These are the kinds of things that many institutions do now. And I think we should be aware that there'll probably be some kind of committee that abolishes the university in a way that doesn't really talk about it in a way that perhaps we might intend it to. And so I don't think there's anything we can really do about it. I think this is kind of the power of liberal institutions, right? That they feel that they can suck up and incorporate any kind of critical or radical discourse into their own kind of ideological terrain and therefore confine it within its own ideological parameters. And I think all we can do is be vigilant of that and criticize it where necessary, and our discourses and our language has to respond accordingly, right? And I think this is part of the reason why the language of global revolution, isn't talked about in the way that it is today, right? But it's talked about in different kinds of iterations.
Jen?
Thank you, Adam. I'm just wondering whether the state is always the creator of these institutionally racist institutions, or does this, of course, extend to environmental NGOs? And I work a lot with white environmentalism. So do we need to be also, therefore, abolishing white environmental organisations? Thanks.
That's a really good question, yeah. Yeah, so I guess I talked about capital, right? And I talked about the state, but I didn't really talk about the third sector, probably because we would be here all night. And I think the short answer, of course, is yes. I worked a number of years as a youth worker in East London, just after the kind of onset of austerity. And without going into a huge amount of detail, lots of neoliberalisation of youth work and the so-called youth sector was escalated during this period. And I saw the ways in which deficits models of, these people are, they weren't referred to as backward, but they require civilizing in one way or another, was led the funding models and what have you of these kinds of local NGO initiatives. And I would say, and I would describe them as in many ways as being carceral, right? They were considered to be ways of controlling, working with the police, working with the prison systems to, in some ways, lessen the burden on the police and prison system, but maybe operating as the carrot to the stick, right? Rather than it being an alternative model, right? And of course, we can think about international NGOs as having a more coherent political economy, perhaps attached to them as well, right? And international NGOs as being framed as being this avenue to so-called economic development, right? Within a neoliberal context, which of course is fundamentally framed by racial capitalism. So yes, I think we should understand NGOs and talk about them in the same breath as we talk about international capital, right? I think they play a crucial role in the facilitation of the existing kind of racial orders that underpin the economic powers and hierarchies of the world. And I think they play that kind of dual role in simultaneously facilitating capital, right? But also, of course, creating this illusion of progress in one way or another. So yeah, if I had all day, then yeah, I probably would have gone on a very long and meandering rant about the third sector. I'll save it for my undergrads.
Thanks for your talk, Adam. I really got a lot out of it. I'm also quite inspired by your call to build community infrastructure as part of the way out, or one of the ways to be resolving this. I'm inspired to build community infrastructure, but I'm also aware there's a whole school of literature around how community is a way to corral and control subjectivities, to get people to behave. I suppose community is not unproblematic either. And so I don't want to problematize the ray of hope that's shining through your talk at the end there, but I wondered if you could say something about that.
100%, mate, 100%. I mean, community is this amorphous thing, right? So I think the reason we talk about community-led infrastructure, on the one hand, is because, and this maybe goes back to the point about cooptation, very often we can interpret demands for non-police solutions to community safety as a return to the golden age of the welfare state, right? Where we had council housing and the NHS was properly funded, and you had state-led employment creation, strong unions, and everything was just great. And of course, we know that everything wasn't great because we've been reading the pages of the Black Voice, where they were making very clear that things are not that great. And so, rather than returning to the welfare state, which was of course a mechanism of disciplinary control, right? And we can exclude you from this welfare mechanism if you don't act accordingly, in ways which are, gendered and racialized and classed and what have you. But also, we need to therefore think about this kind of infrastructure as being community-led. And the reason we should understand it as community-led isn't because the community, of course, is this perfect place where everyone kind of holds hands and is together and sings Kumbaya, but rather because the community, unlike the state, isn't this almost an impenetrable set of bureaucracies which we have very, very little control over. If there is a problem in the community, we are able to access and attempt to fix it in a way that is far more accessible than if there is a problem in a set of state bureaucracies and state institutions. Right? So the reason that we talk about infrastructure as being necessarily community-led isn't because community is this perfect vessel for us to kind of fill whatever kind of infrastructure and the solutions we need into, but because community is far less solid and opaque and rigid a structure, right? It is necessarily fluid and tangible and, I hope and I believe, fixable in one way or another, right? And improvable in a way that state institutions are, I think, far less improvable. And I think that's why the focus on thinking about things as being community-led is so important.
So I had to ask my neighbour how to do it. Hi, sorry, I knew I said I'd come and I'd try not to talk. That was lovely and wonderful, as always, when you speak. But I was wondering when people were speaking, and I know this is a conversation you and me have had, but so we can have a bit more of it in front of other people, that some of the rhetoric, the practice, the ideas around abolitionism are, as Ruth Wilson-Gilmore is saying, a continuation of what the global left will for revolution has been, but it's a global revolutionary consciousness that no longer can believe that the infrastructure of power, of practice, of distribution that's in place is only lacking our capture. That's what it says. We used to think, all of our side used to think, for half my lifetime and all the bits before that all this stuff that the ruling class has, just we can get our shit together and take it, it's on. But we have learned, dreadfully, and I was thinking actually when I was sitting down, in some ways, it's a bit like the post-Bandung equivalent of realising what Stalinism is like, seeing what the post-colonial nation in the hands of previous liberation movements is, that makes that no longer a feasible dream for us. And it means, and it's all within what you're saying, and I know that you write about this more than I do, that abolition is absolutely about the remaking of social and political life for all our needs. And it's also a kind of implicit critique of the carcerality that has been within movements for liberation, that the sometimes Stalinist, sometimes nationalist, sometimes just pragmatist. And so I think there's all of that going on. But, I think this, say here, but I think that the ways in which people have taken up abolition is heralding a kind of resurgence of revolutionary thought and practice across the world, unlike I have seen in my lifetime, in terms of street politics. But somehow that's not in British academia, certainly not in geography, don't want to be rude about geography again, but not in any other discipline either, frankly. That's kind of not reflected in terms of, look in the streets. And I kind of wondered how some of, your vim, how you think it might get spread around this discipline or others, or whether we could do some stuff together to make people see, look, it's not just another paper. Look, it's on.
Great question. Thank you, Gogi. Obviously completely agree with you. I mean, Fanon always said that the worst people to run a post-colonial state were the people who ran the anti-colonial movement, right? These guys just need to retire, right? Thanks for your work, guys. Just, here's the watch, just go and chill, we need to, right? Because you guys are just, all you know about is fighting and hierarchy and violence and you did your thing, but... this, and we see this, right? We see this with the authoritarianism of many post-colonial states, and what have you. And yes, ending carcerality isn't simply about us being like, we want what the ruling class have, because now the ruling class have basically got guns and prisons and cops and borders and stuff. It's like, no, actually, we don't want any of those things. We need to build something different, right? And of course, those things we need to build differently aren't simply forms of physical infrastructure of care, but of course we need to remake our social relations, right? We need to rethink gender, we need to rethink sexuality, we need to rethink all of the ways in which we interact and understand each other, right? As well as building kind of material, physical, tangible things that we can touch, right? The understanding of those kind of revolutionized social relations are absolutely crucial as well. But what can we do here? I mean, that's an important question, right? And okay, so when I first started doing this research, started the PhD, in 2013 or something, and people say, oh, what are you doing a PhD about? And I'd have my little kind of like elevator spiel, right? And I'd say, I'm looking at how black communities are organising to defend themselves from the police. And people always look at me a little bit confused, because they wouldn't expect that sentence to end with the word police. They'd expect it to be like other black people, I assume. And so they would stutter for a second and say, oh, in America, of course. And I'd say, no, here in Britain. And they would just, well, okay, right, all right, good luck with that, whatever. But of course now, when I tell people that, oh, this is my research, people are like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, of course that's what you look at. Oh yeah, because I read this thing recently, or I saw that thing, or did you watch that video about the thing? Oh yeah, actually, I know someone doing a similar kind of thing over in Birmingham, or over in, up in wherever. And it's been, within this relatively short period of time, even the very idea that there should be a set of community campaigns which defend people from the police has gone from being something which doesn't seem to make sense. This seems like a counterintuitive set of propositions, or something, this thing that happens in big bad America where race happens, to actually being wholly normalized, right? And when I say wholly normalized, I mean when I come to conferences like this and I tell people, right, what I research, right, there isn't the same kind of surprise. So I feel like in many ways it is happening. And I don't think I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say, let's continue doing what we're doing. But I do think it's snowballing. And I think if there isn't a conversation between academia and what's taking place on the streets or in radical journalism or what have you, certainly there is some kind of some kind of connection, right? Because it would be a remarkable coincidence that people are thinking through questions of abolitionism, and you have, and particularly in the US, you have geographers, right, like Ruthie Gilmore and others who are leading these kinds of these ways of thinking, but it also taking place on the streets, right? But I think the question is, okay, so where do we go from here? Right? Is this going to kind of naturally, organically continue to snowball in a way that is kind of, if not convergence, complementary? Or do we need to be far more active in the ways in which we think collectively and think together about these kinds of questions to ensure that we don't remake wheels or find ourselves in different places or don't effectively utilize and collectivize our intellectual and other kind of resources?
Thanks a lot for the brilliant talk. I have a question that is related to one of the previous questions about the community, the limits of thinking in terms of political alternatives in terms of the communities. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, how shall we rethink the relationship between abolitionism and new internationalist project or internationalism from below? Because my problem is, what are the boundaries of the community and who belongs to the community? You mentioned black communities, but I think that abolitionist horizon can also move beyond that, right? And rethink political alternatives that start from unsettling the boundaries of the community. And in this case, I think that the question of migration becomes crucial, right? Not just to add another oppressed component of that community, but for that, because it pushes us to rethink abolitionism in relation to internationalist projects. And in this respect, I'm also wondering if you think that is important to multiplying the genealogies and legacies of abolitionists beyond the US and the UK. I'm thinking about anti-prison struggles that happened in the 70s in France or in Italy or in Brazil, or struggles against asylums, psychiatric asylums that happened in the 70s in Europe. And now this can become a legacy for building a memory beyond the US and the UK.
Great. Yeah, amazing question or set of questions. So, yeah, I think rethinking abolitionism and internationalism from below is one of the really crucial questions, right? Because abolitionism isn't as logically international as global revolution, right? Names, clues in the title, right? And I think, obviously you touched on a couple of examples of how we're seeing that play out already, which I think are really crucial. So some of the ways in which we've seen it happen, of course, are quite explicit forms of international solidarity. So some of the protests that we saw in 2020 and 2021 were, of course, the End SARS protests, so thinking about the anti-police protests in Nigeria and how these were being connected both to thinking about similar kinds of anti-police protests in Britain, but also thinking about the way that colonial British policing has shaped Nigerian policing and how contemporary British policing in relation to training, consultancy, the proliferation of weapons and what have you continues to shape policing in Britain's former colonies. We can understand these currents of neo-colonialism, right? So we're seeing this kind of internationalism in relation to abolition, I think, through those types of connections, I think, although they're relatively small and embryonic at this particular moment. What's far more, of course, clarifying, I think, are two other kinds of approaches to abolitionism. Right? The first, of course, as was mentioned, is the critique and the abolition of borders as being a fundamental part of this approach, right? And this, of course, enables us to to push back against parochial ideas of the community, right? And instead think about communities in more convivial kinds of ways, right? And understanding communities as being the kind of mundane, normal, benevolent multiculture, which makes up post-colonial nations like Britain, but of course many other places and communities as well, right? And I think in many ways the campaigns to abolish borders are as, if not more, kind of compelling and popular in this particular moment anyway than campaigns against prisons that aren't used for specifically undocumented people, right? And the antagonism with the Home Office in relation to deportations and the floating prisons for undocumented people and what have you, I think is a huge rallying point and is crucial for us to internationalise the kinds of abolitionist thinking that we're currently considering at the moment. But of course, the other way we're thinking about it, I've mentioned this before, so apologies if you heard me say this, but of course is our critiques of militarism, right? And we're seeing this, I think we probably saw this perhaps most coherently with the Corbyn project, right? Where Corbyn would make very clear and popular criticisms of militarism by saying, look, if you want to, if you're genuinely concerned about the lives of people in Libya or Afghanistan or Syria, what have you, what they probably need are, to build, better hospitals and schools and roads and ports and have, stronger trade unions for its working people and all of these types of things. That's what they need, not bombs, right? Not tanks, not military occupations, right? It's a very, very logical set of arguments. But of course, they are the very same arguments that abolitionists use in relation to police. If you want working class communities to thrive, what you need to do is not to make them live under the threat of incarceration or deportation. What they need are schools and hospitals and houses and stronger trade unions and better jobs and all of these types of things as well. And so I think it's important for us to put these two, I think, in many ways, quite popular arguments in closer conversation with each other, because I think they're based on very similar, certainly interconnected logics around care and freedom for people, which push against militarism and other forms of state violence in a way that I think, as I think the popularity of things like the Corbyn projects demonstrates, resonate way beyond what we might consider to be people who are already part of the left, right? So I think thinking through questions relating to conviviality and migration, thinking it through things in relation to anti-police projects outside of the Anglophone North, but crucially also thinking about it in relation to resistance to militarism are maybe three ways in which we can better internationalise these current abolitionist currents.
Are there any other questions? Anything? Nothing online. Is there?
Thanks so much. That was fantastic, and I loved every bit of it. I'm going to ask, like, as I think is tradition, the question that is actually troubling me, as opposed to like really what you're talking about. But I've been struggling for a long time, and I have like a degree, and much of what others have said, like about the community, about struggling, that I have this kind of anarchist sympathy where I was like, we just get, the state is not a retrievable institution, but then there's the challenge that if we're just doing things at the community, I still think we want the money that the rich people have, and how do we get it? And where's the project of redistribution fit in this? And then conversely, this kind of anarchist versus grab the control. How do we imagine our relations to geography? Are we, should we be taking over the councils of our associations? Or is it like Mountains and Harvey's undercommons? Like we just we do our projects and the larger discipline is what the larger discipline is, and it's not our project. I guess, like, is the RGS the state?
It's definitely colonial.
Cool. Okay. I don't know if I've got an answer to your second question, but interesting, I was debating this recently with some friends. But I think, do we want rich people's money is an interesting question. I don't know if money is necessarily what we want. I think we want, maybe what we want is like our surplus labor, not stolen, right? I guess that's maybe a more specific way of thinking about money, right? Like, oh, can actually, the value that I produce of my work, can I get that, please, right? So I think that's what we want, and maybe we could backdate those payments. I don't know, right? And we want the means of that production, right? And then we want all the other things, the material things, right? That where you accrue your rent from, right? We want housing, right? We don't want you to just have all of this housing. We need that housing collectively, right? And so I think, yes, we want some of the things that rich people have. But I think it goes back maybe to what Gargi was saying about like, actually what we want isn't what rich people have. What we want to do is actually, what we want to redistribute is the power that they have. Right? That's kind of what we want to do. And then we want to do something very, very different of that power, right? Which isn't monetary. Right? It's something very different, right? It's something which is about care and safety and, crucially, freedom, right? Freedom from exploitation, freedom from violence. And that's the way in which I might, I guess, conceptualize what it is that we want from rich people, probably. What you do with the state, man, I still don't know. I think in our current political moments, which, isn't looking great, of course, particularly in the context of like catastrophic climate change. I think that the state is the only set of mechanisms that we can use to rein in capital enough to not destroy the planet. In my heart, I'm an anarchist, but I know that the crisis is too urgent and the stakes too high for us to not actually say, this is the only mechanism that can like clean up your mess, right? So for the time being, I think the state is the mechanism through which that needs to be done. So states for now. Sorry, that's all I've got, sorry.
Hi. I wonder if we need to think a little bit more geographically about the state and about the scale of the state. Because there's some stuff in your presentation that wasn't there, which might be the sort of the history of the GLC in the late 70s, early 80s, and particularly the way that radical socialists used the local state to get hold of some of these issues. good work done in London. Liverpool, where I'm from, obviously a very different story with the Militant Council and the Liverpool 8 black community. And one of the issues that the militants said, and perhaps it might be worth thinking about, is who is the community for black communities. And they would be arguing that this needs to be locally elected communities, local elected councillors that are able to have that kind of accountability that you mentioned. You were saying that you thought that if there's something wrong, you could go to people at a local community. Other people might say, there's power relations in local communities, and actually that might be a little bit more the problem. And that made me think, I wonder if you had any thoughts about sort of the new municipalist movement that there is around at the moment. So, in Barcelona, there's Barcelona en Comú, where they're thinking about relationships between the community and the local state. Or sort of off to the United States, things like Cooperation Jackson, where people are, in the southern states, black folk in the southern states are working away, and they're working with the ideas from people like W.E. Du Bois, that was talking about, black empowerment in the 19th century. The Nation of Islam very much looked at black entrepreneurs to be able to create alternatives. There's Black Wall Street, the Black Panther Party and their food programs. So I wondered if there might be something that's developing at a local state level, that things like the Forefront group that you pointed to, might that be a sort of very prefigurative version of that, and that might be a politics that we're starting to see come through, because we've got a failure of local democracy, haven't we, at the moment? Look at Starmer and everything that's happening. Any radical ideas are being annihilated from the Labour Party. In Liverpool, we've got this group called Liverpool Community Independence that are developing at a local authority level. So I wonder if you might think a little bit more about the local state, or tell me, no, you don't think that's anything that's up there with the third sector as something that's part of the system of domination, which we might want to think about as well.
Okay. So yes, I think there are many avenues of resistance. Yeah, this is probably an aspect of the previous question which I didn't really touch upon too much, sorry. And of course, as I'm sure many people are aware, even very prominent members of the Black Panther Party in the US ended up running for mayor in specific cities, and running for office and attempting to infiltrate these kinds of institutions. And hopefully it isn't a cop-out to say there are many avenues of resistance. And I'm not going to tell people who have patience that I do not have to engage with the Labour Party, councils, all of those mechanisms of bureaucracy and local and municipal state infrastructure. If you have the patience to do that, and you have the skills and expertise to do that, fantastic, 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 fantastic. And if you can do that to funnel resources to community organisations, which they desperately need, even if it's just a warm place to have a meeting, or it's a building that they can have to run, support for domestic violence survivors or young people or whatever it might be, that is crucial, crucial, crucial work that I'm glad that some people have the patience and knowledge to do. And I'm not going to begrudge people for doing that kind of work, certainly not. I think it's important, however, for us to, as I said, understand there are multiple avenues of resistance, right? And that therefore, simply because people are putting their energy and resource into certain kinds of municipality, or even trying to get a socialist to be head of the Labour Party, which, or a prime minister even, doesn't mean that we have to throw away or negate other avenues of resistance as well. And we have to, I think, maintain a wider and open-minded understanding that these different avenues of resistance should and can and must, I think, be complementary to each other. And as I mentioned previously, in the face of catastrophic climate change, even the national state can and needs to be complementary to these kinds of local community-led solutions if we're going to deal with the climate crisis to the extent that is currently necessary. They have to all be complementary at I think, this current conjuncture. And so, yes, as I said, I will not begrudge, but it's not my area of expertise or knowledge, and it certainly isn't something that I have a huge amount of patience for, but I'm glad that others do, because it's not to be dismissed.
Okay.
Can I?
One last question, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you've partly answered this. I look at anti-blackness in climate change, and for me, it's how we build frameworks for confronting this anti-blackness in climate change, not just in the state, but in the whole of society. It's a massive stumbling block.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think, again, climate change isn't even though I've mentioned it a few times, isn't my area of research, but certainly I think we have to understand racial hierarchies as being fundamental to rationalizing something so wholly irrational, right? And I think this is part of the power that race and racialization has, right? That we can be on the very brink of ecological collapse, but race playing a really crucial role in rationalizing the continuation of extraction and of destruction of the environment. Right? I guess we saw it in comparable ways during the height of the global pandemic. Right? It's called a pandemic, everyone. It's everywhere, but yet we see this kind of vaccine apartheid, right? Where certain governments are hoarding these vaccines in ways that are wholly irrational, go against every kind of logic of epidemiology, right? And I think race plays a really crucial role in rationalizing that irrationality, right? And I think we can see this in even more destructive ways when it comes to thinking about climate breakdown and ecological catastrophe. And therefore, I think it's fundamental for us to think about and problematize racial hierarchy when we're tackling these questions relating to climate breakdown, for sure.
Cheers. Thanks, Adam. That was a fantastic set of kind of provocations and discussions as well. So before we thank Adam one last time, just to say there's a reception which is going to be in the marquee. You can pick up a ticket for some drinks on the way out. But I just want to say thanks again for a fantastic set of insights into what, as you say, is a difficult conjuncture. So thanks again.